Okay. Just want to check in with everybody. Um, can you let me know that you can hear me? We're having some technical difficulties. I have no idea why it won't bring the video part of it over. So I just want y'all to check in and make sure that y'all can hear it. And we're going to go ahead and get started. But I need somebody to check in to make sure that this is working and that the audio is okay. So I'm going to wait for y'all to do that. Can somebody check in and let me know that it's working okay? All right, awesome. Okay. So we're going to get started. This is a very interesting. We're on chapter 9. We're going to do 9 and 10 tonight. We're primarily going to focus on Sedona. Y'all recall he's kind of like the financial advisor to the Vatican Bank, for lack of a better word. And beginning with who in the U.S. chain of command knew anything about Gladio, Condor, or any of the other strategy of tension episodes? And what you find out is basically we had the OSS and the CIA afterwards running around with basically no oversight. And that was perfectly fine with the presidents because um, they would kind of give broad guidance to the National Security Council. And then, it's kind of like the see no evil, hear no evil type of scenario. So as long as things were happening, the less they knew, the better. So the when you get into the 1950s, you had the Eisenhower administration directed the CIA to undertake covert activities in Iran, Guatemala, and Indonesia. And what I found interesting, which we remarked on before, is the timing of the intervention of the CIA in Indonesia is 1957, which um, Obama was born. So there were clear, significant CIA operations going on in Indonesia at the time, and there's lots of rumors about his stepfather and mother both being affiliated with the CIA. So this kind of matches that up. And again, it's an indication of the more history you know, the more things when you read them will stand out to you. So these missions were conducted without any congressional oversight. Um, Congress was eventually briefed in 1961 on the Bay of Pigs invasion um, and a few other clandestine operations, but there's no evidence that the White House or Congress sanctioned the establishment of the Castle Bank via the CIA or the Bank of Credit and Commercial International, which is the BCCI money laundering bank. We're going to learn about a new one tonight called Nugent Hand Bank, after a guy by the name of Nugent and a guy by the name of Hand that was set up in Australia right after the Castle Bank goes defunct. So, um, always have to have a place to launder the drug money and the weapons money. So, in the wake of the Watergate and revelations about the CIA involvement in the toppling of the government in Chile, the Congress passed foreign assistance called the Hughes-Ryan Act in 1974. It stipulated the president must personally be informed on all covert operations, and there has to be what they refer to as a finding in order to make sure that they are required to ensure our national security. So it was kind of a way to try to hold the president responsible, but they've never done anything with it. Despite this legislation, the CIA continued to engage in subversive undertakings, including the shipment of arms to the rebels in Angola and the Kurds in northern Iraq. They eventually have, in 1974, a church committee named after um, the Senator Church, that was the head of it. And like all committees, it's where things go to die. They basically don't do anything about it. Um, Congress has declined to offer any oversight over any of the intel programs. Um, and there were a lot of findings, if you will, but basically they did nothing. And the records revealed instances where intelligence agencies have concealed improper activities from their supervisors in the executive branch and from Congress. And yeah, like we don't know that part. Okay, so Jimmy Carter, during the Iran hostage crisis, encouraged the CIA not to inform Congress of what they were doing in Tehran. Who then has been directing the killings, the terror attacks, the coup d'etats? Who was sanctioning the transactions with the mafia, the drug cartels? Who was creating the secret armies, the neo fascist societies, and the bogus banks? Mikhail Sedona's purchase of Franklin National Bank in 1972, and that's a story in and of itself. So Sedona purchased the controlling interest in the bank from Lawrence Tisch. Lawrence Tisch, at the time, one of the richest men in the world, was acting chairman and chief executive officer of CBS, the media CBS. He also owned a chain of movie theaters, cigarette manufacturing plant, hotels, and a fleet of oil tankers. Very, very rich man. During World War II, Tisch actually worked for the OSS under Wild Bill Donovan. And that goes back to the point I made the very first night we were listening, or we were doing our book review, is that just about every industrialist is a part of the intel operation. Just about everybody in the media is part of the intelligence apparatus. So he is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In 1961, the Christian Science Monitor described the CFR as probably one of the most influential semi public organizations in the field of foreign policy. It's composed of 1,400 of the most elite names in the world of business, government, finance, communications, foundations, and academies. It has staffed every position in every administration since FDR. And the Rear Admiral Chester Ward, who was a member for 16 years, said that a powerful clique within the organization sought the surrender of the sovereignty of the national independence of the United States to create one world government. That's from the inside. The biggest critic the CFR has probably ever seen is Barry Goldwater. Most people aren't brave enough to criticize the CFR, but he said their goal is to impose a benign stability on the quarreling families of nations through merger and consolidation. They see the elimination of national boundaries, the suppression of racial and ethnic loyalties as the most expeditious avenue to world peace. Their rationale rests on exclusively materialism. After noting that the CFR members control both parties, he continued, quote, "When we change presidents, it is understood to mean that the voters are ordering a change of national policy. Since 1945, three different Republicans have occupied the White House for a period of 16 years. Four Democrats have held the most powerful post for 17 years. With the exception of the first 7 years of the Eisenhower administration, there has been no appreciable change in foreign or domestic policy. When a new president comes on board, there is a great turnover in personnel, but no change in policy. Example, during the Nixon years, Henry Kissinger, CFR member, Nelson Rockefeller, protege, was in charge of foreign policy. When Jimmy Carter was elected, Kissinger was replaced with Brzezinski, a CFR member, who was also a David Rockefeller protege. And he hits on several things. So I want to go back to the elimination of national boundaries. Where do we hear that all the time from George Soros' Open Society? No boundaries. That's why what we see now, and we try to put George Soros and these people as, um, the, face of the international syndicate, but now you're seeing they are just people implementing. They're the foot soldiers. The group that is above that, that organized, created the CFR, and is the management behind it, is that next level up, of which Rockefeller obviously is part of. But also the suppression of racial and ethnic loyalties. Now, back to our analogy of cattle prodding. So you've got a cattle prod on the left and you got a cattle prod on the right. The same person created the cattle prods. The same person created the Bolshevik Revolution and the same person created the Nazi regime. So you've got these two cattle prods and we're the cattle. They're prodding us along. What they have to do, because cattle indiscriminately, when left on their own, um, they they tend to, be more cliquish, but if you're on purpose, doing the breeding, you eliminate or create the desirable qualities that you want, and that's what they're doing. The open borders is so that no one has a culture, no one has a group of which they affiliate with, because you are much more bolder and you are much less controllable when you are in a group of culturally like-minded people. And many people said during the pandemic, the reasons why they closed down the churches and they closed down all the meetings is, we all know that during the revolution, those are where the planning happens. So if they can break down your culture, they can get you to leave your religion where you are like-minded people banding together. They strip you of your culture so that you're much more easy to mold into what they want you to be. And that's the whole purpose of the CFR. And there's a lot of foot soldiers around doing their business. And the other important point about that is that it does not matter. So what happens is it's musical chairs. So there's a group of 50 people, we'll just throw that number out there. 25 label themselves as Republicans and 25 label themselves as Democrats. They're all in the CFR. So when the Republican president gets picked, he nominates the 25 that have Rs. He may stray every once in a while and do a D, which has happened. Like, for example, Clinton had a Republican cabinet member. That's very rare, but they do that. But when the Democrat gets elected, all he does is go pick out of the same CFR group of people who self-identified themselves as Ds. It's the same group of people. So, on with the book. In 1972, when Sedona purchased controlling interest in Franklin National, which again was a bank owned by Tisch, um, the CFR was a haven for spooks, spies, diplomats, blah, blah, blah. Among those members were Alan Dulles, the CIA director, William Buckley, a CIA agent and the publisher of National Review, CIA Master CIA operative Robert Bowie, Ronald Gregg, Catherine Graham, who was a CIA advisor and publisher of the Washington Post, and they name a whole bunch of others, Morgan Stanley, um, a lot of military people, which I got to tell you, so dang depressing. General um, Limitzer, who was the SACEUR. He's the guy in charge of NATO from 63 to 69. Dean Atkinson, Henry Kissinger, David Kennedy, which was Sedona's business partner. He also served in the U.S. Secretary of Treasury for a couple of years. Other members talks about Admiral William Crowe, Thomas Gates, who was the SecDef, um, W.R. Grace, which is J. Peter Grace, um, the guy in charge of Time magazine, Irving Kristol, which is Bill Kristol's communist dad. Um, his Encounter, which was his magazine, was funded by the CIA. Um, and Robert McNamara. And what's interesting is when you look at these people and where they went after they were in the government. For example, McNamara went on to be the president of the World Bank. Rockefeller was Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York. David Rockefeller, the CEO of Chase Manhattan, also created the Trilateral Commission, which is another group basically like the CFR. Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey. So Larry Tesh has been widely held as one of the most astute businessmen in history. But for some reason, um, there's this bank called Franklin National, and he bought it through his LOEWS, Lowe's Corporation. And this bank was located in Long Island, New York. 2 months after he bought it, the federal bank examiners found out that it was on the brink of insolvency and had $211 million in loans. Tesh was in a compromised position, being the major shareholder and a member of the board of directors of both the holding company and the bank, which you're not supposed to do. So it gets investigated, and he's brought up on charges. As soon as the investigation got underway, Sedona, the Vatican Bank financial advisor, appears at Franklin like the next couple months later and offers Tesh $40 a share, while the bank wasn't worth that much at all. And so at the time he purchased it, it was posting a loss of $7 million and had been classified as a problem bank. So Sedona suddenly shows up with this offer. Why would he do that? Why would he take that risk? Well, some things, and let me share with you also that even failed banks can be great money laundering opportunities. But there was a guy by the name of Arthur Roth, who served as the CEO of Franklin National from 46 to 68. And David Rockefeller, who was at the time the CEO of Chase Manhattan, and his brother was Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Roth testified that he ran into trouble with the Rockefeller brothers when he sought to establish a Franklin branch bank in New York City, because that was the Rockefeller territory and they didn't want him there. So Roth created a list of shady dealings with the Rockefellers and presented it to the reporters when Nelson Rockefeller arrived in California to campaign for presidency. God bless him. That was a brave soul. The wrath of the Rockefellers knew no bounds, and he believes that they concocted a plan involving Tesh and Sedona to basically take the bank out, because he still had a minority interest in it. Sedona purchased the Long Island Bank through his bank, his holding company, Fasco AG, which we talked about a few nights ago. He was represented by the law firm Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander, which is where President Nixon and Attorney General John Mitchell had been partners. So it's one of the CFR banks, or law firms. Sedona informed the SEC that he had raised $40 million for the deal by selling shares in several of his Italian businesses and banks. to a guy by the name of Alberto Calvi, the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano. Tisch got his money. The SEC seemed to be satisfied. The comptroller of the currency asked no questions, but nowhere can it be verified that Sedona actually got $40 million from any of those entities. So, how did he get the $40 million to hand over to Tisch to buy the bank? So, David Kennedy, Sedona's old partner, took a place on the board of Fasco AG and assumed responsibility for voting the shares of the annual bank for Franklin National. So now he's basically sitting on the board with the vested interest in Franklin National as part of the Fasco AG. Kennedy at the time had left his position as President Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury to become the U.S. ambassador to NATO, one of the highest ranking federal officials, and he's involved in this whole bank fiasco. When the deal was announced, Jack Bigone, a journalist for ABC in Italy, aired a report saying there's concrete evidence that has been established that shows Michele Sedona was involved in heroin trade with the American and Sicilian mafia families. This report should have raised enough suspicion that at least the deal was investigated. Several months after the broadcast, Bigone was contacted by a guy by the name of Angelo Serino, who supposedly was a Palmetto police detective, who told him that he possessed documents concerning Sedona's ties to not only the mafia, but also the CIA. Bigona arranged to meet Serino, and on the day of the meeting, Bigone was kidnapped from his office by two thugs. He appeared 2 months later in a clinic in Rome, exhausted and frightened. Bigone told the police that he had been forced to fly to the U.S., had been transported to several cities, including St. Louis, New Orleans, and Las Vegas, where he was grilled about who the source of his story was, who told on Sedona, who said he was involved in the drug trade. Bigone said that he had pledged never to seek further information about Sedona or to follow up on his story in any way. He made a promise, and the journalist said that he was going to keep it. So they obviously did whatever they had to do to intimidate him. Now he's going to shut up. Thinking that the Bigone story was fishy, the Italian magistrate charged him for simulating a crime and ordered a full-scale investigation because he thinks the reporter's lying. The authorities ultimately gathered enough evidence to support Bigone's story. Unfortunately, they were unable to question the guy that basically set him up, the Angelo Serino, because that detective was found shot to death, mafia style, on the street of Palermo. No loose ends. That reporter's probably very lucky he's alive. The only questions about the bank deal and selling Franklin came from Arthur Roth. He wrote an open letter, and he's so brave, and included it in in a full page ad in the national newspapers like the New York Times. And he asked a whole bunch of questions that should have been asked by the bank regulators. Like, where did the $40 million come from? And he says to the CEO of the cell, it raises questions. Do you know enough about Michele Sedona to unconditionally recommend him as a person that you would be good, that would be a good bank owner? Will there be a full disclosure on his finances, his backers, and detailed biographies? 3, why would he pay $40 a share when it's currently selling for 32, having run up from 28 because there was rumors of sell? 4, what are his intentions regarding the additional purchases, and what role will he play in the operation? He addressed that letter to Tisch, who never responded. Arthur Burns, chairman of the Federal Reserve, opted to turn a blind eye, as did Peter Peterson, the Secretary of Commerce. CIA Director Richard Helms, and James Schlesinger. All four men, along with Tesh and David Kennedy, were all sitting members of the CFR. What is the Trilateral Commission? It was created in 1973 by David Rockefeller, who became its first chairman, which sought to create a new world order controlled by multinational corporations and banks, i.e., the international syndicate. During Operation Condor, Rockefeller traveled. Now, Operation Condor was basically Gladio in South America. Rockefeller traveled through South America, telling the newly installed dictators that the CIA and Condor put in place that they were basically going to fall under the umbrella of the US as basically like a satellite state. In China, or excuse me, in Chile, where the 1976, the military regime under General Pinochet ignored international condemnation and the congressional cutoff of American aid because they were terrorists, because Chase Manhattan and Rockefeller had given them $927 million in loans. So you understand what we just have said. You have the international syndicate, the industrialists, the banks, the political apparatus, and the CIA, which is their hired military slash terror force. They go create the strategy of tension in these countries. They overthrow a duly elected president. They put in their thug, and the first thing the thug does is take out loans from these international syndicate banks. That's what we got going on here. It's just another form of stealing, because it is the poor people in these countries that are going to be left with that debt. And as a dictator, the 927 million that came in loans did not go to that country. So that's the deal. You create all this turmoil, you overthrow governments, and as we saw in Brazil, what they did was the new government basically sold off all of the companies by creating economic turmoil in the country to the international syndicate businesses. So they just literally rape and pillage these countries of all their resources, all of their industry, and saddle them with debt, which creates more instability and the endless refugee flow into the United States to effect their one world government. So the financial nightmare. In keeping with Gladio's game, Sedona's purchase of Franklin National created a financial nightmare. The bank was in a tailspin. They ended up having an income of 2 cents per share, where the previous year had been 68 cents a share. So it's teetering on the brink of collapse. And it just so coincidentally, the next year they suffered a $40 million loss, which $40 million is exactly what was supposed to be was paid for it. So they the Federal Reserve decides that because it's on the brink of collapse, they're going to help it by bailing it out. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars pumping money into this failing bank, and yet another way of money laundering. So they take FDIC money that has been paid in as a fee by all of the insured banks, and they throw it at a quote unquote failing bank that they knew was going to be a failing bank ahead of time. And no doubt, if you go back and trace the shares of this bank, all of that money comes in they use it to loan it out at the 10-to-1 ratio. So then when it actually does fail, nobody has to pay any of the loans back because the bank's gone. So Franklin's terminal condition had been issued warning notices about Franklin's terminal condition had been issued by Morgan Guarantee Trust and a host of other places. And the Fed had shelled out $2 billion by the time it was all done without any chance of them getting a penny of that money back. So that money went to the international syndicate. In 1975, Peter Schick, a former executive vice president of the bank's international division, pled guilty to fraud. You had he was sentenced to 3 years. Another guy, another officer, was convicted of fraud, but not a single thing was done to David Kennedy, who was administering the shares as Fasco AG, nor was anything ever done to Sedona. Nothing. And they are the ones that created it. So Sedona, meanwhile, back in Italy, has raided all of the assets out of Banca Privado and his Banca Union, Italy's national union bank, which he purchased with the Vatican in 1970. He merged the two firms and created a thing called Banca Privata. So now that one's bleeding, and it had a loss of 200 billion lira in 1974. He managed to convince the directors of the central bank in Italy to put in another 200 million into that failing bank, of which they got not a penny back. And 3 months after its creation, Banca Privado went into compulsory liquidation with losses of over 300 million. So that created kind of a stair step, and it also affected the Vatican Bank. So it is estimated that it cost the Vatican Bank about $1 billion because there was a domino effect. Now, keep in mind, they tell us it was $1 billion lost to the Catholic Church, but keep in mind, none of the drug laundering money was ever accounted for within the Vatican coffers. There's no, remember, because we talked in the first night about the Vatican Bank's records are 100% sealed. You can't look at them, you can't audit them. And so there's no record, but we do have people from the inside that said that anywhere from 15 to 20% fee on every dollar that went through there for money laundering, and billions went through there. So the fact that the Vatican is saying as a result of Sedona's loss of these banks, or that they lost $1 billion, really doesn't mean that much, because at the end of the day, they were swimming in money at the Vatican Bank because of money laundering. So moving on, shortly after the stroke of midnight on October 4th, 1974, Gelly, now remember, he's the P2 um, Grand Master Mason guy who's also in the Vatican as a Mason and atheist. He made a call to Sedona, who was staying at a chalet in Switzerland. He told him that the Italian government was preparing 2 arrest warrants for him, one for the false balance sheet that created the bankruptcy. He tells him to leave Switzerland before they notify Interpol. Get out of there before they can extradite you. Your enemy, it says, if you don't, our enemies will torture you. They may even kill you. It is very dangerous, Mikhail. Things have changed. So throughout Europe, prominent bankers had lost a fortune thanks to Sedona's financial shenanigans, and were now demanding the arrest of the Pope's banker. Sedona heeded Gelly's advice. He packed his bags and headed to New York. where he remained under the protection of the mafia and the CIA within his luxurious suite at the Hotel Pierre on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Life was good in the Big Apple. Sedona's daughter, son in law, two granddaughters moved in with them, and every night they would dine at Cafe Pierre on the ground floor of the Hotel Pierre, where chefs prepared him special dinners, and Sedona became the, you just can't make this up, financial consultant to Johnny Cambino's and the Gambino and Genevieve's concrete company, which is basically the mafia. He also became a lecturer in economics at American universities, to include the University of Pennsylvania. He waved the American flag, talked about democracy, kind of like the Democrats do today. The aim, here's a quote. The aim, perhaps an ambitious one, of this brief talk is to contribute to restoring the faith of the United States in its economic, financial, and monetary sectors, and to remind it that the free world needs America after he's been working to destroy it. He also gave lectures at Columbia. Um, he was just had been at Columbia when he gets sentenced in a Milan court to 3.5 years in prison for embezzlement. But he had no worries because he knew he was going to be protected. Sedona may have been an honor at the Ivy League institutions and private social clubs in Little Italy, but the bronze doors of the Holy See were closed to him. The Italian investigators uncovered the Vatican's ties to Bank Privata. Pope Paul VI became an object of scorn and derision. People called for his resignation. The Jesuits attacked the Pope for his interference in Italian politics and placement of the church's future in the hands of the devil. They demanded his abdication. The Sedona affair in February 1975 called the Pope a traitor to the church in one Catholic weekly. Archbishop Marcinicus, now keep in mind, he's the one that is in charge of the Vatican Bank now after Sedona moves on, was forced to submit to the indignity of intensive questioning by Italian officials because he supposedly was off limits as the Vatican Bank guy about his transactions with Sedona on a personal basis and as well as the representative of the Vatican. He told U.S. investigators that Mikhail and I are very good friends. We've known each other for many years. But then 2 years later, he was asked by an Italian magazine what that relationship was. And he says, I don't even know him. This is the Vatican banker, guys. Sedona was shut off not only from Marcinicus and the Holy Father, but also from Roberto Calvi, the new Director General of Banco Ambrosiano in Milan, who refused to receive his calls. Calvi and Marcinicus advanced Sedona's scheme of raiding the assets of the Milan bank by setting up a string of shell companies as unofficial subsidiaries of the Roman Catholic Church in Panama and the Bahamas. These companies began to receive massive loans from the bank and from the bank's holding in Luxembourg. Calvi and Marcinicus removed Sedona's name as the director of the Nassau Financial Front Company, which had become known as the Banco Ambrosiano overseas. So even though this guy's been caught dead to rights, the Sedona guy, the other people that are in charge that are criminals of the Vatican Bank just keep right on doing what they've been doing because they're laundering money. They have to have front companies. They have to have banks. So Pope Paul VI fell into a purple funk because of feeling like he had let the church down. He says that he wants to make amends for the financial loss that was caused to the church. He wished to retain the right to name his successor. So he starts bargaining with the people that are calling for his resignation. and saying that he wants to make up for the fortune that he's lost. But again, it's all a lie because they got billions of money from the drugs. Um, so in September 7th, 1976, the U.S., acting on behalf of the Republic of Italy, initiated an extradition proceeding against Sedona in the Southern District Court of New York. The president of the Supreme Court in Rome swore that the charges against Sedona were part of a communist plot to undermine leading industrialists of Italy, and claimed that the left wing extremists would kill Sedona if he was to come back to Italian soil. So basically, the Supreme Court guy, who is also one of the P2 Masonic Lodge guys, says, "Oh no, you can't extradite him because to be kidnapped and murdered by the communists, those fake communists that were all part of the Operation Gladio that never existed." So basically, he doesn't end up getting extradited. So he once that statement got made, Sedona appeals his extradition and basically says, "Oh, and by the way, he's probably going to face charges here, and that would be double jeopardy," which he didn't. While Sedona remained free due to the bizarre interpretation of habeas corpus, the Italian government continued to press for his arrest, even though the Supreme Court has basically, in Italy, has basically screwed that up. This pressure prompted the Pope's banker to initiate action against his adversaries, including Ambrosio, the Italian lawyer who served as the liquidator to Banca Privata. He had damning evidence of Sedona's role in the collapse of the Franklin National Bank to John Kinney, a prosecutor in the U.S. DOJ. The evidence included transcripts that proved Sedona had pilfered funds from the Italian bank to purchase the shares from Tisch. He had obtained checks and documents. He had everything. Sedona was laundering heroin profits through the Vatican Bank to the Gambino crime syndicate. He secured information from Lieutenant Colonel Varisco, who had been investigating the Masonic Lodge P2 and Gelli. Well, in true Italian style, on July 11th, 1979, only hours after conferring with Kinney, that guy was shot and killed in Rome after parking his car in front of his apartment. 2 days later, Varisco and his chauffeur were killed by a hitman with a sawed-off shotgun, and Giorgio Giuliani was shot to death while having a drink at a bar, and his replacement at Palermo Police Department was a lodge member. So, lodge members doing lodge member things, taking out everybody who wants to talk about anything they're not allowed to talk about. So, while mafia assassins eliminate the problem of his Italian adversaries, Sedona continues to plan a coup, and this is just crazy. So, he starts planning in America a coup to separate Sicily from mainland Italy. And your first thought might be, that's crazy. Except there were people here that Americans, to include military members, that were on board with that. And why would you ask, would we be on board with that? Well, it just so happens that all of these people are also Masonic Lodge members, and the majority of them, all, even the military people, have something to do with the CIA. And as it turns out, if you remember in night 2, when we were talking about how the Corsica um, Corsicans mafia in France had the pharmaceutical company that had all of the intricate labs to do all of the heroin processing, and how Italy had began creating labs elsewhere, um, to, facilitate that because they ran out of room. They were processing too much heroin for that one facility. Well, it just so happens that the second choice that they had was to create all of those same kind of capabilities in Sicily. And so they've got this little island strategically located that they figured that they could create a coup, separate it from Italy. They've got a destroyer, um, US Navy off the coast while this is supposedly all going to go down in case mainland Italy gets a little too feisty and decides that they actually want to defend their own territory, that the US Navy is going to step in and go, no, we got it. And use that then as the CIA's new drug processing facilities. This just blows my mind. So, Mikel Sedona, Johnny Gambino, Rosario Spatola met in a room on Staten Island, and Sedona tells them all about this plan. And the US military, he's quoting, the US military has authorized me to do this. They will not participate in the coup, but there will be a fleet off the coast of Sicily after we have taken over. They will enter the island to help restore and protect us from Italy. And he produces a letter from an Admiral Morris basically saying that. And he tells these guys, all I need is a few more people. So we're going to work on this together. And of course, the guy kisses his hand. He's like, oh my gosh, you're the best thing since ever. And yeah. So in later, well, and prior to that, um, Carlo Bordani, a guy that worked with Sedona, had been arrested at the request of the U.S. Justice Department for his role in the collapse of the Franklin National. So Italian journals in which he spoke of the Sedona Syndicate, including the ties to the Vatican and the CIA, Mario Baroni, whom Sedona appointed to head the Banca Privata, spoke of the list of 500 that Sedona kept in a safe deposit box, which was the 500 politicians, industrialists, and mafia involved in Operation Gladio and the smuggling of hot money out of Italy. So the walls are starting to close in on Sedona. The federal officials left Bordani in a filthy cell in Venezuela 3 years before extraditing him to the U.S., and by that time he was willing to spill his guts. The trial date for Sedona was set for September 10th, but St. Peter's banker was not terribly worried. The U.S. intel officials he had served for so long was going to take care of him. He was just convinced of it. After all, his only crime had been to make the world safer for democracy by opening the floodgates of black funds, to pay for Operation Gladio. Few men could have done more. And then on August 2nd, Sedona walks out of his luxury suite at the Hotel Pierre and disappears forever. He's never been seen again. So, Sedona's dream of an independent Sicily was shared by the CIA, not only because of its strategic location for its U.S. military bases, but then they talk about the whole labs and um, some numbers for you. By 1971, there was 500,000 heroin addicts in the U.S., producing $12 billion just in the U.S. Over 3 million people had admitted to using heroin at least once. 41% of all drug deaths was related to heroin. So all they've done with fentanyl is repeat what they did with um, opium. And don't for a minute think that this same network of people is not behind fentanyl. Because if you think it's China and you think it's a cartel that's operating on the border of the United States with the CIA around and they're not in charge, You're crazy. That ain't happening. Southeast Asia remained the main source of opium at the time, and this again is in the early 70s. From Laos alone, over a ton of opium arrived every month in Saigon on cargo planes that were provided by the CIA. So much opium was flowing into Saigon that 30% of the American servicemen in Vietnam were heroin addicts. Heroin was smuggled into the US in body bags containing dead soldiers. That ought to make you vomit. When DEA agent Michael Levine attempted to bust this operation, he was told by his superiors, no way. Cash from the network contained to be deposited in the mob in parochial banks throughout Italy. The money continued to flow into the Vatican Bank. Oh, here it is, 15% processing fee before the funds were transferred into privately held mob accounts in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, and the Bahamas. But this system was not equipped to handle what had now become exponentially bigger than it originally had. So they were looking for new money laundering opportunities. One of the first of these operations, you will remember we talked about this before, was Castle Bank and Trust. That was Paul Helliwell's bank that he created in 1962 at the beginning of this thing. He formed a bridge between the poppy fields of Thailand and organized crime in the US. Helliwell retained his dual role as CIA paymaster and mobster counselor. Helliwell organized an entire Caribbean banking circuit, numerous Panama shell companies. He continued to operate Sea Supply, which was a company, and became the Thai. He was in charge of the Thai embassy in Miami's relationships with the U.S. Operating out of American Banker Insurance Building, ever industrious, Helliwell also served as legal counsel to Meyer Lansky's protege, Santo Trafficante, who we talked about before. He's the guy in Tampa that was a mobster. He was also an advisor to Lyndon B. Johnson. Helliwell was. In the Cayman Islands, 14 telex numbers for banks. The nation only had 30,500 residents. Offered banks a free Luxembourg and Liechtenstein. Within a decade, Castle Bank had joined the Caymans by a branch of Nugan Hand Bank and the World Finance Corporation. So all of those are CIA operations. Nugan Hand Bank was opened in Australia as they began bringing drugs into Australia as well. The funding for Castle Bank came from International Diversified Corporation, a CIA-controlled Panamanian holding company. CIA operative Wallace Groves, a convicted felon who had served for 2 years in prison for selling worthless stock. CIA had assigned Groves such tasks as organizing coups, funding political parties, and cleaning up dirty money. Money flowed into Castle Bank not only from International Diversified, but also from a host of underworld figures. And they list a bunch of them. They're all mobsters. From Ohio and Las Vegas. Castle Bank was joined at the hip to Mercantile Bank and Trust, another CIA operation set up in the Bahamas by Helliwell. The bank shared most of the same directors. International Diversified Underwriters Bank Limited, all created by Helliwell in the Bahamas. The majority shareholder for one company would be American insurance conglomerate American International Underwriters Corp., which was established as part of an insurance empire headed by former OSS agent C.V. Starr. And it eventually became AIG. So you've got the foundation of AIG as a CIA op. And for those of you who have not read a lot of history, if you go back to the 1800s and early 1900s, every industrialist had a business, whether it was railroad, mining, um, GE, like electrical, whatever. They had a business and they had a bank and they had a trust company and they owned an insurance company because they anything that they didn't want, they would burn down and collect the insurance company money. So there was a lot of fraud in insurance, but every single one of them had a bank, an insurance company, a trust company, and then something that looked like a legitimate company. So basically, the international syndicate has replicated that in the black world. So they have these insurance companies that they hide assets in. They have something that looks like a legitimate business. It's a front company. But they do buy real estate and hard assets. They do buy real businesses with this dirty money after it gets laundered a few times. And they have a bank and they have a trust company. So they have just taken the model from 120 years ago that the international syndicate set up, and they're redoing it in the CIA. Nothing new. In 1976, Mercantile was closed by the Bahama government after investors discovered the bank holdings were worthless. And Price Waterhouse had just been there and said everything was fine. It collapsed, supposedly saying it had $25 billion in assets just 2 months before the Bohemian government came in and said it was worthless. So where'd that $25 billion go? To another laundry mat? That's my guess. So supposedly they were all of that money was loaned out to unidentified individuals. This is how they launder money. In 1977, the IRS launched an investigation into Castle Bank that became known as Project Haven. Investigators obtained evidence of much of the money deposited in the bank going to underworld figures involved in the heroin trade in Southeast Asia. This evidence led to a grand jury investigation, but it was shut down because the CIA come in and said, "Hey, that's going to endanger national security. You can't look at any of that stuff." Which in a normal world would have been, "Hey, that means it's all dirty. Hey, Congress, why don't you look into this crap?" Nothing. I'm sorry, but there is nothing in dealing with collapsed banks and drugs that should have anything to do with our frickin' national security. Our national security should not hinge upon drugs. Moving on. In January of 1980, two Australian policemen driving down a road see a Mercedes, a late model Mercedes, parked on the side of the road. They walk up in the front seat. It's the body of a burly middle aged man. They find a business card of William Colby, the former director of the CIA. On the back of the card was Colby's itinerary for his trip to Hong Kong and Singapore. The dead man's hand was wrapped around the barrel of a new 30 caliber rifle. Next to the body was a Bible with a meat pie wrapper as a bookmark. That's not weird at all. On the wrapper was scrawled the names of Colby and California Congressman Bob Wilson, then the ranking Republican on the House Armed Services Committee. The dead man was identified as Frank Nugent, co-owner of Nugent Hand Bank and one of the most prominent lawyers in Australia. His death was ruled a quote unquote suicide, because of course it was, even though Nugent's fingerprints were not anywhere on the rifle, and only a contortionist could have shot himself in the head from the position in which he was found in the vehicle. So he was knocked off. Nugent's partner, Michael Hand, a former Green Beret who served in Vietnam, Learned of the death, he rushed back to Sydney from London, began shredding what could have filled a small cottage full of documents, and held a meeting at Newgan Bank with the directors in which he warned them that he must follow his directions in destroying all of the bank records. Likewise, they would otherwise they would finish up in concrete shoes or find their wives being delivered to them in pieces. In June 1980, Newgan Hand Limited was in liquidation. It owed almost $50 million dollars to creditors. Hand fled to the US, never to be heard from or seen again. So now that's interesting because again, they take in these assets, they launder them, and then because they're a bank, they can make additional loans. So they basically steal another 50 million on top of what they've already laundered through these banks. And it could be, in many of these cases that the people that end up opening these banks, that's kind of their payoff. So the mafia and the international syndicate just wants the money in and out in a laundered fashion where their assets while they transit the bank justifies these loans. And maybe the guy who creates the bank, like this Nugent Hand, there's two different people, they get these fraudulent loans and keep that money. Who knows? But there's definitely something in it for everybody because they do it a lot. So the Nugent Hand Bank had been established in 1973. Shortly after setting it up in Sydney, it blossomed into 22 branches, which tells you right away it's messed up. Um, one of the branches was in Thailand's opium industry, and that bank's branch was in the same office as the US DEA office. When you called that bank, if they weren't there, the DEA receptionist answered their phone for them. So if that doesn't tell you everything about the DEA, I don't know what does. So the guy that was stationed there, Nell Evans, said that he saw millions pass through that office. So, and they all knew it was CIA. The CIA was used to purchase weapons from international arms dealer Edwin Wilson for guerrilla forces in Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Brazil, and the white Rhodesian government of Ian Smith. Wilson was a former CIA operative who was later convicted of selling arms and explosives to Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. But what's interesting about that is he was actually set up on that one. I looked that up. They brought him, somehow he ended up getting on their wrong side because they set him up on quote unquote selling guns to Libya, and it was later overturned because he had not done that. So he must have got out of sorts with them. Funds were also shelled out to undermine the Liberal government of the Australian Prime Minister, who had pulled the troops out of Vietnam. So basically, they overthrew the Australian government, and they pumped millions of dollars in supporting the Christian Democrats, which was his opposition. So another prime minister bites the dust thanks to the CIA. But hey, the only election that they don't interfere in is the US election. They interfere in everybody else's election, just not the US election. Keep that in mind. The bank also imported heroin into Australia from the Golden Triangle. The Australian police officers in service to the CIA, according to the Commonwealth of New South Wales Joint Task Force on Drug Trafficking. In 1976, one such officer organized 5 shipments of heroin into Australia, mostly in false bottom suitcases. Each shipment, the branches of the Nugent Hand were used to transfer the money from Sydney to Hong Kong. That's just crazy. Over 100 pounds of heroin was involved in each import shipment. You give me heroin, we're going to give you money. Okay. The president of the Nugent Hand Bank was Admiral Earl Preston Yates. Yes, that's a military U.S. officer. who served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for U.S. Pacific Command during the final stages of the American withdrawal from Vietnam. Now, that's something else that you're going to see as a common theme. These generals that are involved, admirals, generals, whatever, that are involved with the CIA, it basically, and I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg. I don't know if they end up being in Vietnam because of the war and they get recruited there, or were they recruited elsewhere and put in Vietnam so they could facilitate the shipments of stuff. I think it's the latter because I don't think they're going to take a chance of getting an officer into a theater that isn't um, already with them and compromised. So that makes you want to go back to Afghanistan since we know that the whole reason we were in Afghanistan was poppy and opium and drugs, to look at every single one of those generals that were in charge of that theater at from the entire 20 years, because it would be a great in-depth research project to check every single one of them out and where they're at right now and what they're doing. Because what I have discovered in the research that I've done is all of these general officers, for example, there's a whole bunch of them that had the Philippines all over them. And when you look at the Philippines had stay behind units. They've actually discovered them. They've discovered gold buried in caves. They've discovered stashes of weapons all over. And look at what the Philippines has. They have the same quote unquote, threat from the communist infiltration that they used as an excuse to destabilize it. So, anyway, back to the book. So, we've got Admiral Earl Yates, who served as the Deputy Chief of Staff of U.S. Pacific Command as they're withdrawing from Vietnam. General Edwin Black, the bank's representative in Hawaii, commanded American troops in Thailand, again, Poppy, during the Vietnam War, having previously served in the National Security Council. So maybe that's where they're getting them. Maybe they're compromising them on a DC tour, and then they get these assignments after that. He also had worked in the OSS. Lieutenant General Leroy Manor, who worked for the bank in the Philippines, had been appointed the chief of staff of PACOM, while General Earl Koch, a World War II veteran and former Brigadier General of the Georgia National Guard, worked as a consultant for the Washington Bank. The board of directors and staff of Nugent Han was a who's who of CIA officials. And just off the top, a few of them. Dr. Guy Parker, who worked for RAND, and everybody says RAND's a CIA think tank. Major General Richard Secord, which of course we remember from the Iran-Contra. So here you got a guy who in the Reagan administration is doing money, drugs, weapons, and oh, shocker, he's also involved in the corrupt bank. Walter McDonald, retired CIA deputy director. Holgreen, former chairman of the CIA Civil Air Transport, which ends up being Air America. It's their airline. Theodore Shackley, who was their clandestine operations guy in the CIA. Richard Armitage, who was he was a special consultant to the Pentagon for Thailand. He oversaw the transfer of heroin profits from Indonesia to Shackley's account in Tehran, Iran. Patry Loomis, a former CIA advisor to Vietnam. Robert Jansen, former CIA station chief in Bangkok. So now these are the people that you put as the board of directors of a bank. That's crazy. So the Nugent Bank was set up and used as the follow-on to Castle, as right after Castle collapsed. And what's very interesting is now you've got Australia sitting down there Um, with a collapsed bank, all these people's financial futures are ruined. And not one single time did Australia ask the United States to extradite Han. Han's been spotted in the United States. Not one time did they ask to extradite him. Tells you everything. William Colby served as a legal counsel. So, William Colby is a very interesting guy, and he was the CIA director at one point. But we've talked about him in the um, former chapters of this book, the previous chapters, but they do a little bit more of a deep dive right here um, because surprise ending. William Colby served as the legal. Um, he was a lawyer. We'll just put it that way. After organizing the Gladio unit in Scandinavia, which was his first job, he was dispatched by the CIA to Rome, where he worked with the Vatican, basically on their Gladio operations. His budget for black ops in Italy was 25 million a year. That buys you a lot of guns. Colby was the ultimate Vatican insider. He once famously remarked that the global intelligence services maintained by the Vatican left the CIA in the shade. As the commander of the CIA station in Saigon, Colby ran intel ops during the Vietnam War, including Operation Phoenix, a Stalin like program that resulted in the assassination of an estimated 40,000 civilians because they were supposedly cooperating with communists. Just a massacre, basically. Um, for 3 years, he served as the director of the CIA. He was removed from this position by President Ford after revelations of domestic spying by the agency captured national headlines. So you can do it, you're just not allowed to get discovered doing it. 4 years later, his business card is found on Frank Nugan's pocket in Australia. No doubt Colby was deeply involved in Gladio. Um, the money laundering into Australia would also make sense. Um, he they give you a few examples of the stuff that he was involved in, but it was everywhere. Iran, Burma, Thailand, generating about $2 million a year in drug trades at one point. Throughout his career, Colby remained loyal to the Vatican. He was a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. Remember, we were talking about that earlier, that basically the Pope had knighted all of these people into this Military Order of Malta that was going to be working on this operation. Um, Also knighted, we heard about earlier, was Gelly, who was the atheist that was knighted by the Pope. Just totally bizarre. Um, Colby also had very strong ties to the mafia. Um, After the shutdown of Nugan Han Bank, he worked with members of the Giannini crime family to set up Household International in Chicago. Household International eventually becomes HSCB, the big bank in the UK, who just had a guy charged with being an accessory to Jeffrey Epstein. Once a crook, always a crook. Household conducted ongoing business with gangster and infiltrated First National Bank of Cicero and the Vatican controlled Continental Bank. Both of those banks went bankrupt. Excuse me. This Colby met a very mysterious end. You may have heard. Um, I don't remember who it was that came to his house, but basically, the first person that arrives at his house, he was in charge of the CIA, so he's going to be a very careful guy. All of his computer stuff was open, as if he was just went to the bathroom. Half-eaten food on his plate in his house, and supposedly, he walked outside barefooted down to a boat dock without a life jacket, which his family said he was obsessed with having a life jacket on anytime he's around the water. probably for reasons like this. Um, but he just disappears. So a week later, divers find his body. He's dead. So that happened in 1996. So he obviously had met the end of his usefulness. Um, they also go back to the Nugent Bank and talk about the around the time the fall of Saigon happened. Once the major gateway for the world drug market, Saigon had become a dead end because the Viet Cong, imagine that. So you've got the Viet Cong, which are the big bad baddies called communists, and they get rid of all the drugs. So now they're completely cut off out of Vietnam once Vietnam falls because the communists didn't want anything to do with the drug trade. So um, they can't get the quality of heroin that had been being produced out of Vietnam. So they have to go and look for another place. And in 78 and 80, the Golden Triangle was hit with two severe droughts. Plus, you've got the Burmese army that starts destroying all the heroin laboratories on the Thai border. So that all gets wiped out. And now that that basically isn't gonna generate revenue for Gladio, they had to go look for, um, another location to grow their crop, and that is how we transition into, well, Turkey is an interim stop, so they did use Turkey, um, for Europe primarily, but also some of that ended up in the US, but, they shift to South America at that point. So the author notes that with the setbacks in Southeast Asia, the source of funding for the creation of the New World Order now is in jeopardy. So in 1978, just when things couldn't get any worse, Pope Paul VI suffered a massive heart attack and died, and his successor, Albino Luciani, who called himself John Paul I, has issued a call for reform. So it looks like they're about ready to lose the Vatican. And you know dang good and well they ain't going to let that happen. So we'll stay tuned for chapters 11 and 12 next time. And we'll move on from there. Do we have any questions from anybody? No, no questions. Is that pretty is it making sense as far as being able to extrapolate the things that has happened in the past, to be able to see, um, more clearly what's going on today, where you have basically the same kind of setups. You have drug trades, drug routes, you have banks, the bank failures oftentimes are related to the illegal activity that they're involved in. There's just so much of our history that we don't know, that just like the whole way that they set up their operations with the bank and the insurance company, and a legitimate business 100 years ago, they do the exact same thing now when they're uh, creating the um, illusion of legitimacy today. So they basically created the CIA to do under the government auspices what they did, but were at risk for doing. So if you have an organization, they bring the full weight of the government behind them. I mean, it's a brilliant idea. So you have all of these individual industrialists hanging out there that if any one of them could be whacked at any time if somebody spills the goods on them. But by taking that operation and putting it under the auspices of the US government, I mean, it's actually a brilliant idea because now the industrialists benefit from it, but they're never gonna be held responsible for it. Let's see. The military connections are mind-boggling. I know. I trust me. I know. Um, I came in late. We'll watch the beginning when it's okay. So, well, I don't know that we're ever gonna make the CIA slash fentanyl connection, overtly. I'm not gonna be the one breaking that news, I can tell you that. Um, but what I will tell you is every as, Feta said, we recognize patterns. So the pattern of we went from whiskey during the prohibition and how that whole control mechanism went. We went from that to drugs, and the first drug, opium, and then it transformed. We went from opium to or heroin to LSD, and every single iteration has been the CIA. So there's no freaking way that a creation of the next iteration of drugs, fentanyl, because look, the bottom line is this: the CIA is in it for the control. They're in it to generate black money to fund black programs. If anybody cut in on their territory with a new drug called fentanyl that they weren't a part of, they blow them freaking up. That's just the bottom line. They would not be safe walking down the street. The CIA still has stay behind units, guys. They're not gone. They would be dead man walking. So you can't convince me that the fentanyl industry is not controlled by the exact same people that has controlled everything else for the last 100 years. You just can't do it. Too many new AT4s with tails. Um, it's just a similar pattern as large. Yeah, it's exactly that. Um, whatever is happening. So again, in the whole border situation, do you honestly think that these men that have killed hundreds of thousands of people, they have no heart, they've sold their soul to Satan, is going to allow uneducated, um, heathens in their view, not mine, their view, to ride roughshod over our border and not be in control of it? That's crazy. That would break a pattern. So all of a sudden, you've got these crazy Mexicans with guns, and all of a sudden, this organization that has developed over the last 100 years that has controlled every single drug for 90 years, for the last 10 years, haven't been in control. And they let these heathens on the south side of the border um, run an operation without them. Not happening. You're right, it doesn't have to be the CIA, but here's what I would say about that. This is a very well orchestrated the international syndicate, at least in my mind, are the families and the industrialists and the bankers. They're not getting their hands dirty. They created the CIA for a reason. The CIA is their private military. So in as I was pointing out earlier, when you go to South America, it's so clear that they topple the government in Brazil, they gobble up all of the industry, um, they take all the resources. Same thing happened in Bolivia, same thing happened in Chile, same thing happened in Russia. As soon as the Bolsheviks took over Russia and got rid of the czar, GE was in there setting up their electrical system and stealing all of their resources. So that's a pattern. They do that every single time. So the the drug trade has been exclusively conducted and managed out of the covert operations of the CIA. Um, and so they are a subordinate unit, if you will. And you're right in the fact that they are part of the same organization. Um, but they are definitely the ones doing it, and they are doing it as a subsidiary of the international syndicate. But because the international syndicate is invisible, they brilliantly created the CIA to shield them. The CIA is their cloaking device. So if they get caught doing what they're doing, it's going to be the CIA, which means nobody, that's going to be the fall guy. In the past, if you went back to 1920s and these guys were caught doing that shit, they could actually gotten in trouble because they were not a representative of the the government. They had some risk, which of course is why they set up their trust company, their insurance company, and all that other crap was to minimize that. But at some point, somebody had a brainchild that said, "Hey, if we take all these thugs that we've been hiring and we put them under the employment of the US government, which we control, by the way, um, it's brilliant. Brilliantly evil. How about that? So, anyway, that's what I got for tonight. Um, we probably um, will do a session tomorrow. It may be a little earlier than normal, and we will definitely do one on Saturday if regardless of whether I do one tomorrow. So probably Saturday evening around 6 or 7, we will do definitely our next one. I'll try to squeeze one in tomorrow if I can get to it. How's that? Thanks everybody for being here. I just don't want to say it's them out loud. I know. I told you my husband always jokes to everybody when we go into a restaurant when we're meeting somebody for dinner. He over exaggerates where he's going to sit because he says that he can't sit between me and the glass window or the door. So, yeah, I got you, Julie. I'm reminded of that every time I go to dinner with my husband. So, as I sit in front of my big picture window in my office. Anyway, thanks. See you next time, everybody.